Good morning. It is a pleasure to be back for the second week of this series. But before I get started, I didn't have time last week to say this, but I just want to give a big thank you to Jonathan, especially since he just stepped out of the room. I can kind of go on about him and not embarrass him. But a lot of my friends and colleagues around the country and around the world, for that matter, look and catch wind at some of the stuff that we're doing here in Houston, and they are very jealous. And they say, Brian, how on earth are you able to do this? What is your church thinking? What is your pastor thinking? And I start hearing about their situation, and basically, a lot of times they have a very good pastor, but who might not have a heart for missions. And so a lot of what we see, a lot of the little projects that we do, the programs that we start, the trips and the various incentives that we've been doing over the past several years and are going to continue to do, a lot of this comes because we have a senior pastor that has a heart for missions. Not many people would give up their pulpit for 4 sermons to let the mission pastor preach on discipleship issues that relate to missions. And so, but that's exactly what we're doing. So big thank you to Jonathan and to his heart for missions. So this month, we are taking 4 Sundays to talk through different issues that relate to discipleship. Discipleship specifically that relate to issues in mission. And so last week we talked about expectations. Who should go? And from the text that I shared, my main point was that no matter who you are, no matter what the background is, no matter what the surrounding culture has told you about who should go be a missionary, the Great Commission belongs to all of us. It belongs to the least of us, even. And so this week we're going to talk about family. How do we address family expectations? And so to help me kick off this discussion, I have a couple of the ladies that I interviewed in our last video last week. They're going to help me again this week talk about family issues that are from their various cultural backgrounds. I do have to say one thing about the video, and I should have said this last week. There is going to be a screen that sticks, and it's not actually video, it's just a photograph of Bel Air, and that's because the young lady that I was interviewing would do that only on the agreement that I wouldn't do a video of her because she is headed to the country. I'm sure you can put it together from the clues in the video where she's at and where she's from, but she did not want that with her face on it going on the internet. And so let's go ahead and play the video. I know the Latin American family is very, very strong. How do families view, children or brothers, sisters, whoever, who go on mission?
They usually think we're crazy.
Okay. Sometimes in the North, this is a common sentiment as well.
Yeah, I think that most parents who have missionary children think we're crazy, regardless of where you're from. But so in order to explain this, I'm 27, but if I lived in Honduras, I would still live with my parents because my family is not as much as it used to be, but still somewhat a source of life. Like, they'll provide for my house, somewhat for housing, somewhat for food, stuff like that, where I don't have to worry about that. But it's also a cultural understanding that why would you move out before you're married?
Right.
Why would you spend money? Unless you go to a different city for work or for studying, right? But when I'm at home, I lived at home last year for an entire year. I was at home with my parents. It was hard for me, but that was the expected cultural thing, and there was no need for me to go against it. And so it's especially hard, especially for families who are very traditionally Latino. Traditionally, what has happened is that, let's say Grandma and Grandpa had a certain amount of land, not too big, not too small. Well, they had their house in the back. Mm-hmm. Then, let's say they had 3 children. Well, the children will make their houses on the same land of property, like on the same property, and so on and so forth, until there's literally no more space for anyone to build. And even so, you might start building up instead of moving away. Right. So it's a very close-knit group of people that you see often, that you have to spend time with often, and it's pretty hard for our families because we're not even expected to leave home. For example, in my own family, my aunt lives with my grandma, her children still live there. My cousins are about 26, 25. Like, there is no foreseeable, like, they're not about to get married anytime soon, so they're not about to leave anytime soon. And even when they get married, they have to choose, are we going to live there or are we not? Like, some people still choose.
And if they move, they're probably not moving very far, I would assume.
No. Why would you do that? Right? Like, so with family, it's hard. Even, and I think that it's hard not just to leave them. It's really hard to explain why you're leaving them. And that, to me, I think is the hardest part. Because I think that my family sometimes just sees this as like, well, they love Jesus, they're Christian, but sometimes they just see it as me being rebellious, going against the system, being like the odd one out, and even, just not loving them as well as I should, which is hard because that's not necessarily true.
Okay, so I might be about to overemphasize something, but that's just because the average listener might not be aware of like how family pressure relates. Because coming from an individualistic society, we kind of do whatever we want without understanding the sense of like generational obligation.
Right.
So your parents came from Vietnam to the United States. They fled a war. They've put you through college to some degree or another.
Well, some of them. America put me through college.
Or at least expected you to go through college.
Yes.
Okay.
The government.
And you did some kind of, what kind of degree did you do?
It was a business degree.
Business degree, okay. So all of this is respectable.
Yeah.
And now you come home and you say, Mom and Dad, I'm going to be a missionary.
Right.
How does that sit with your family?
Yeah, my dad isn't a believer, so he doesn't make sense of it. Like, I mean, he thinks I'm crazy. So that's that. But my mom, who has growing up going to church and know the context, right? She was like, why do you want to be American? Is that, like, it was a very, like, this is what Americans do, or like someone has convinced you to do this, because that's not, it doesn't seem logical. To her, it didn't seem logical. She thought I was doing it for my esteem, my own. Maybe she thought at one point I wanted to be a martyr or something. And I was like, no, I never said that. I wanted to do that. But to die is to gain. No, sugar. But what I think she was saying is like, I want you to be saved. Like, I want you to be here. But some of it was like, you just want to do your own thing. You want to like pursue your own thing, not like what will honor our family or whatever. Because then you're seen as poor, you're seen as like all these other beggar and stuff.
Yeah.
And so.
So they see the choice for missions as kind of a manifestation of individualism just by itself. Different cultures do things differently. Let me ask you to think about this for a moment. When you call a pastor to a church, what does the process look like? Most churches that are Baptistic or congregational in nature probably start some sort of committee and look for applications, resumes. Maybe they know some people that friends of the church might recommend for them, and there's some kind of decision-making process that's involved with that. This feels pretty typical, I think, for here in the States, especially amongst lower church denominations. I went to school in Portland, and one of the men in our cohort was from Korea, and he was fairly young. He was in his 30s, and his dad was significantly older. This was a kind of Korean phenomenon, and he said he was sharing somewhat transparently in class one day. He said, I want to be a pastor here or a teacher here in the States, but my dad wants me to come back and take over the ministry, to kind of pick up the mantle. It's a hereditary thing, passed from father to son. He wants me to come back to Korea and run the missions organization that he started, 50 years ago. And all of the Americans in the class were appalled that his dad would have these expectations. And all the advice they give was, no, go home and explain to your dad that you're being true to your calling and that this is the dream and vision that God has given you. And they kept saying all of this stuff, which was rooted essentially in American culture, not necessarily in the Bible. And I'm listening to both sides of this equation that are clearly speaking past each other, going, wow, I had never thought of any kind of ministry leadership being just a hereditary thing that was passed from the leader to the next person of his choosing. And here, that's the expected norm. So from these stories, from these three ladies and my school colleague, I see that there's three challenges that relate to family when we think cross-culturally. Number one is family honor. Number two is family love. And number three is family dependence. And based on our culture here, these might not be things that we understand readily because we're a very individualistic culture. So most of you, if you grew up here, probably had the majority of the decision on who you married, where you live, what kind of job you have, what kind of degree you had. Most of that you were probably able to decide either completely on your own or significantly on your own, right? I feel like that's a pretty common American thing, is we each get to do our own thing. And the idea even that our parents would say, well, I think you should be a this or that becomes a point of contention and even a point of rebellion, an accepted form of rebellion, of going against what your parents want for you, marrying that person that you want to marry, not who they want you to marry. But throughout most of the rest of the world, we are really the odd ones out. Your parents have the majority share in what you study and who you marry and where you live and decisions that are made inside your home, even in your adult life. And so I'm not here to say one culture is right and one culture is wrong. I'm simply saying there's a vast difference of how we see the involvement of the family, of who is in the family, who are the decision makers in the family. And so family honor relates to how is the family viewed from a standpoint of opinion, from a standpoint of reputation out in the community. What jobs are respectable? What jobs are not respectable? What person can my child marry based on, do they have a respectable family? Did they have a respectable job versus not? And so there are certain lines, there are certain lanes which people stay within in order to maintain the family honor. And so if you think about the second girl who was sharing from Asia, she's in the context where her family fled Vietnam and came here to the States and have worked and worked and worked to put her through college and to make sure she's on the right path. And now she wants to go be a missionary. To us, we go, well, yeah, sure, that's easy. But for her, she feels this sense of family pressure and obligation. Family love, you heard this in Evelyn's interview, where she's talking about people in her church asking her, do you love your family? One person, this is later on in the interview, she goes, do you hate your parents? Is that why you're going to be a missionary? And obviously that's, not to say no one does that, but that's definitely a wrong motivation for doing missions. If you're doing missions to flee people you don't like, just stay put. And then finally, family dependence. This idea of individualism in our society is supported by our ability to be independent. My ability to have my own bank account separate from my family's bank account, to have my own job separate from the influence of my family, to own my own property in my own name. All of this enables me to live alone and make decisions alone. This also leads to a lot of loneliness, by the way. I don't know if you realize, we struggle with more loneliness here in the West than most other cultures do. And so in most cultures, even as an adult male or as an adult a woman, both you are still connected to your parents, even after marriage. And so these three things present large challenges, and they always have. We can see them in the Bible, and we're going to talk about some of those today. We can see these in early missions history, middle and late missions history, and we can see them around the world today. You can talk to people at our church and say, ask some of the kids, hey, when you decided to pick that college degree, who made the decision? Who had input? And you're going to get very different answers based on who you're asking. So if you would, stand with me. We're going to be in Genesis 11 today, 11 and 12. And so in 11, we'll read verses 1 through 9. This is the Tower of Babel. It says, now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And the people migrated from the east. They found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly. And they had made bricks for stone and bitumen for mortar. And they said, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of man had built. And the Lord said, behold, they are one people, and they have all one language. And this is the only beginning of what they will do, and nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, Let us go down and there confuse their language so that they may not understand one another's speech." So the Lord dispersed them from there over all the face of the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore, its name was called Babel, because the Lord confused the languages of all the earth, and from there the Lord dispersed them over the face of all the earth. Let's look at chapter 12, the first several verses. "Now the Lord said to Abram, 'Go from your country and from your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed.' So Abraham went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abraham was 75 years old, and he departed from Haran. And Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all the possessions that they had gathered, and the people that they had acquired in Haran, and they set out to go to the land of Canaan. When they came through the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land at the place of Shechem, to the oak of Moreh, at the time when the Canaanites were in the land. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, 'To your offspring I will give this land.' So he built there an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. From there he moved to the hill country to the east of Bethel and pitched his tent, and Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord and called the name of the Lord. And Abram journeyed on and still going towards the Negev." All right, let's pray. Lord, we thank you for this passage, these stories we've heard. We dedicate this time to you. Give us understanding and wisdom and discernment and how to hear what you would have us to do. We ask this in your name. Amen. So there's these two passages which happen very, very close to each other. I think in terms of time and history, they also happen very close to each other. A lot of times it's easy as we're reading. If you're doing the reading plan from the calendar, you should be through here by now. As we're doing the reading, it's easy to kind of gloss over it, especially if you've grown up in church. You think of the Tower of Babel. Maybe you remember the flannel graph and the various figures that were on the flannel graph. Kids, ask someone older what a flannel graph is. This is analog PowerPoint back in the day, analog animation. And so you probably remember seeing stories, pictures, maybe did cutouts in Sunday school, and it's easy just to walk past these passages without giving it a whole lot of thought. Maybe you think, well, this just explains the origin of languages and not much else. I think we have to understand God's big picture in the Old Testament and the New Testament for that matter. And one of the first commands that he gave people, and it's something that he reiterates to them again and again and again, is be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. And we see again and again and again where people reject this command. In the New Testament, this gets translated in the phrase in the Great Commission, to the ends of the earth. And now if we read between those, we look through the Psalms, or we look through Isaiah, and we look through so many different places, we see that God is the God of the nations. His plan is the entire world. His plan is his sovereignty over the entire world. His plan is the salvation of mankind and the judgment of wickedness and evil. And so we see that God's big picture, his original design for man, was that they be spread throughout the world. Now, in the Bible, the way that this gets expressed again and again is through punishment, through disobedience and punishment. And so oftentimes we can think of scattering as being a negative thing, but it's actually part of the original design that God had for man. And so we look at the garden where Adam and Eve sin, they eat the fruit, God comes down, has a conversation with them. At the end of the conversation, they're kicked out of the garden and they have to move. And so the very first dispersion, if you will, the very first movement of people in the Bible is out of Eden, and it's a judgment. Yet that was always part of God's plan, was that Adam and Eve and descendants would fill the earth and spread throughout the entire earth. We see the same thing happening after Noah. So God gave them the command to Adam and Eve to fill the earth, and then again after the flood, you've got one man and his family, they get off the boat, and God says, again, fill the earth. And so again and again, God's people want to group up and want to huddle up. In the New Testament, we see this happening in the church in Acts. God gives the Great Commission, go into all the world. And then by the time we get to Acts, they're basically staying in Jerusalem. And so what does God allow to happen? Persecution comes. What does the persecution do? It spreads them as far as Antioch. And so is persecution a negative? Yeah, absolutely. I don't want any. However, this fits God's plan. His plan for Old Testament people who followed him was to fill the earth His plan for New Testament people is to spread his name throughout the whole earth. And when we huddle up, he finds various ways to send us out. And we see the same thing happening right here at the Tower of Babel and then with the call of Abraham. These two stories stand as opposites, and I'm going to present them as opposites. And so I'm titling this the Babel complex, or mindset or heart, if that's easier for you, and the Nomad complex, or heart. And so in the Tower of Babel, we see this commentary that they move to the east and they find a plain, an open piece of ground. And so I attribute this to comfort. They find a comfortable location. It's right around a bunch of rivers. It's location, location, location. This is primo real estate that they have just stumbled on. And so what do? Hey, let's build a tower. And so instead of continuing to progress, it's just the chapter before where God is talking to Noah and to his sons and giving them the commandment to fill the earth again. And yet here they are, it says they didn't. They stayed together in this comfortable location. This is not just a modern problem that we have. You see, we'll talk more about this in the next week or the following weeks when we talk about one of the challenges being stuff, being the American dream. And we go, well, Americans struggle with this. Yes, everyone in America struggles with this. People who have fled refugee camps, who come to America for the American dream, struggle with this. Who wants to go from a refugee camp to the United States, finally make it to security, finally make it to comfort, and then go, you know what? God is calling me to some other place where I'm going to have to trust him and live moment by moment, day to day, never knowing if it's safe to lay my head down or not. See, it's backwards thinking for all of humanity. Our essential desire is for comfort, is for security. We see that they had technological advancement, not very much, but enough to make them a little cut above their neighbors. And so they developed brick and mortar, and they start building a tower. And this tower becomes kind of symbolic for them. It's not just a functional tower, but the function of the tower obviously is security, it's protection, it's gathering, it's organization. You can see their level of organization. In fact, it's so shocking, God steps into the conversation. But they use brick and mortar, they use these advancements to create a tower. They had a fraudulent theology. They built this tower, the text says, towards the heavens. And so the text here doesn't explain this quite as much, but in general, in most pagan religions and most Canaanite religions in this region, there's an association of the gods, the goddesses, whatever system of belief they have, with height. And so in the Greek system, you had Mount Olympus. This was where all of the gods live in many countries throughout the world. I went to Papua New Guinea, which is largely jungle, but they have mountains interspersed with the jungle. And there's this super tall mountain right next to this swamp that we were living in. I don't know why we didn't live on the mountain instead of the swamp, but that was their choice. And, I did the American thing, which I see the mountain, and I'm thinking, man, let's go climb this. And then all of the villagers start telling me stories of, no. The spirits live up there. That's their place. If we go up there, and there's all these stories of, people who went up there and never came back, except for the missionaries who went up there and told me what was up there. So they don't actually live up there. Newsflash. Spoiler alert. But that's their association is high. In all throughout the Old Testament, you see the prophets preach against the high places. Now, there was pagan worship happening in these high places, but the pagan worship happened in the high places because there's an association of height and divinity. And so here we have them building a tower to the heavens. And so they have a fraudulent theology. They have a selfish identity. They say, come, verse 4, they say, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower at the top of the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves. So their whole identity of who am I, who are we, is we want to make a name for ourselves. We want everyone to know, look at what we built, ta-da. So they had a selfish identity. And then finally, they had an arrogant rejection of God's command. God had told them, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, subdue it. And what do? They find the first pretty spot with some grass and a river, and they go, here it is. We're just going to stay here and build this massive thing until we're done. And so they immediately reject this notion that God is telling them, fill the earth and subdue all of it, and instead they're in favor of staying put. And so this is the Babel complex. It's the idea of this has to be about me and my security. Life is about me finding a comfortable slice where I can just camp out and stay and soak it all in, just experience all of this goodness. And I don't want to go anywhere. I'm going to use all of these advancements, all of these advantages that I have, and I'm just going to park it right here and say, this is enough. This is good for me. Now let's flip to chapter 12. And we see the reverse of this. Abraham's family lived in Ur. This picture right here, we actually have a full picture of this ziggurat here. That's actually not the Tower of Babel. It just also works for the tower visually. This is actually the ziggurat that is in Ur. And this ziggurat is dedicated to the worship of the moon god, who is called Nana. And there were two places that this god was worshipped. One was in Ur, where Abraham and extended family lived. They left Ur and they went to Haran, and Haran is the other place where they also have a ziggurat that is dedicated to the worship of Nana. And so Abraham is coming from a family which is steeped in false worship. They've moved from one kind of holy city to the next holy city where this god can be worshipped. And so many people think that his father was involved in this, that his family is involved in this. So his call is not simply a call to leave family. His call is a call to leave idolatry and to leave false worship. This is somewhat similar to Gideon's call that we talked about last week. Gideon, the first step that God had for him was, hey, that little secret place that your dad has with the trees and the idols and the other stuff, go cut it down and burn it and perform a sacrifice for me there. Okay? And so when God is calling these people in the Bible, he's calling them out of their false belief system. And so we see this happening with Abraham. This whole section with Abraham centers around two commands. Number one is go. Verse 1 says, the Lord said to Abraham, go. So that's one command. And the other command is be a blessing. So this going that Abraham is supposed to do isn't just go to a place that I'm going to show you that's like sunny acres where you too can have the dream Babylonian life, the dream Babel life, where you can build your own little tower and have your own little kingdom. That's not what he says. He says, go to a place that I'll show you. All right, which way do I go? I'll show you. This is a complete act of faith. Second off, he's told to leave his family. Instead of being gathered up with those who think and speak and act just like him, God is telling him, leave his family. He takes his immediate family, he takes his nephew with him. But when we think back through our conversation on family honor, family love, family dependence, again, this isn't the world of banking and loans and GPS and maps. You stayed with the tribe that you were with because this is how you lived. To leave this is almost suicide. To go wander where you don't know what's out there? I mean, imagine going through the desert. You've got to know where the water is. If you don't know where the water is, you die. There's no rescue coming. There's no one coming after you into the desert. And yet God says, go. Go to a place that I'm going to show you, and I will make you a great nation. And so it's a command and it's a promise. And so he's leaving his religion. He's leaving his identity. Family gives you identity. Here in the States, we make our own identity. My identity is who I am. It's my achievements. It's my wealth and my status symbols. It's all of these things that as an individual, I collect up and gather around me. And we see people here in the States, particularly Houston, when there's a flood or a hurricane, a tornado or a fire, and all of this gets ripped away, people are immediately wondering, these things that they put so much meaning in have left them empty, and they're wondering, who am I? Who am I without my house, without my stuff? And so it's the same thing here where Abraham's family gives him the identity. This is why the genealogies are always so specific. You want to know who is the father of who, the father of who, the father of who, because we might have a blood feud between our two clans. You don't know. And so you have to know these things so you know, hey, let's not go into this region of the world because that's the family that 15 generations ago didn't serve bread to our family, and there might be some residual problems that we don't want to face. And so he leaves his family, he leaves the identity that they give him, he leaves the religion that they give him, the provision that they give him. This is one of the elements that flows through many, many stories. We look at the story of the prodigal son who takes half of his father's possessions and goes to a far country. Well, it's wrong in any culture to do this. But there are some added sub-elements of this story, which is if you have a family business and 2 children, and one of the children cashes out half the family business, what happens to your other half of your family business? It's a problem. I mean, just imagine being a rancher here in Texas, and one son takes half of the cows and goes somewhere else and then sells them off. It's not even he takes possession and then keeps them there and raises them. It's he takes them and he sells them off and then just uses the money. Well, the other half of the cows, I mean, there's a science to breeding animals to produce better animals that doesn't work anymore. And so the provision doesn't happen. Family gives you place. I mean, not just physically a place to stay, but a place of meaning. In ours, we find our identity, we find our place in terms of what we create as individuals. But throughout most of the world, who you are is related to who your family is. And that defines everything about you. When we lived in Egypt, all the buildings are 12 stories tall, and you live in one of the floors, and there's a family typically that has the job of being the doorman for the building. And so you'll see brother, sister, mother, father doing different chores and jobs. And our doorman's son was very studious. When it was his turn to sit out front and kind of keep watch of everything, he always had his books out and he was studying. Throughout the rest of our building, though, there was a bit of a snicker about him. And I finally had to stop someone and say, why do you snicker when you see him studying? What is the big deal? And they go, he's a doorman's son. He thinks he's going to go to college. And immediately, I'm a little bit incensed about this because my American side is, no, anybody can go to college. Everybody can pave their, and as that thought is coming through my mind, I'm realizing, wow, I am not in Kansas anymore. This thought that I have that everybody can go to college and everybody gets a shake, and that's not really true there. They were probably, I hope that his studies somehow got him into college and that he's got a better life than picking up a bunch of rich people's trash. But I don't know that would happen. So your family gives you all of these things, for better or worse. Your family locks you into a life. And here God is saying, just leave it. You don't know who I am. We don't know if this is just an audible voice that God is putting into his head. We don't know how it is. But Abraham is hearing this, sensing this, seeing this. We don't know. But Abraham doesn't know God. See, at some point in the scriptures, God will say, look, I'm the God of your forefathers, of Abraham, of Isaac, and Jacob. I'm the one who brought the children of Israel out of Egypt. I did. And he just goes through his resume of who am I? But right now, we're kind of on the front side of this where he's not doing this with Abraham. He's just saying, hey, leave everything you know that gives you meaning and protection and security, identity, and go. And Abraham goes. But the second side of this is the command to be a blessing. Now, Hebrew scholars will debate what exactly this means, and in a lot of Bibles this will be translated, I will make you be a blessing, or I'll bless those you bless, or mine in ESV says, so that you will be a blessing. But in Hebrew, it is in fact a command. In the tense in Hebrew, there is also a thing of you're being commanded, but you're also going to be given the provision to do it, so it's not just based on your ability to do it. But it is a command, and so command 1 is go, command 2 is be a blessing. Now, obviously, this is because of what God is going to do for him and do through him, but how is he going to be a blessing? You see, in honor and shame cultures, if you ask someone, well, how does somebody get honor? Typically, the first answer they will say is money. And it's not just a materialism that they're dealing with. It's not just a desire for riches or a greed that they're dealing with. It's money does stuff. In ours world, money just gets you stuff. In theirs, money does things. It does actions that bring you non-tangible things like honor. So I can't show hospitality to someone if I'm poor. But if I have money and some guest comes through our town or our village or tribe, I can be the one that kills the fatted calf because I have the money for a fatted calf, and I can have them come eat and stay with us. And so I receive honor by having money, but really by that money provides hospitality. I can see a poor person, I go, man, I need to help this person. But if I'm poor also, I may not be able to help them. And so money produces something else in honor-shame cultures, and that is honor, or the lack thereof produces shame. And so God is going to give him the blessings that he needs. And we see the rest of the story of Abraham is everywhere he goes, God blesses him again and again and again and again. Everywhere he goes, whoever he's dealing with, they send him away fat. Every time there's a war, he wins it, and he gets the spoils of war. And so God blesses him, but on the front side of this, of just saying, leave everything, every resource that you have and can humanly think of, just leave it all and go somewhere, and I'm going to bless you so that you can be a blessing. Wow. God is saying, look, I am going to be your new tribe. I am going to be your new family, your new identity, your new place, your new meaning, your new blessing. And so here we have these two mindsets, the mindset of Babel and the mindset of the nomad of, I'm just going to get rid of everything that's stable in my life, get a tent, and start walking that way because that's where God said to go. And yet, Abraham's story, the covenant to Abraham, this is the beginning of the line of the Messiah. This is the beginning of the salvation of the human race right here. And I think a lot of people struggle with this idea of leaving family or letting family leave. But if you're struggling with this, you're in good company. I've got a slide here which has a bunch of different names. We'll just go through a couple of these. Joseph was forced to leave. Same book of the Bible, Genesis 37. He's forced to leave, but in his leaving the family, even though it was forced, even though it was under very dire circumstances, and things kind of went from bad to worse, right? He's sold, goes into Potiphar's house where he works as a servant, then sent into prison. But think of how God used Joseph to save his entire people, to save the line of the Messiah, to fulfill God's promise to Abraham of your people are going to go into Egypt, and then I will show them my steadfast love and bring them out. All of this is done because Joseph was sent away. Gideon, we talked about this one last week, where he had to risk his family honor and his family name in order to follow God. He had to go cut down the family place of worship, and then there's kind of a showdown with his father and the men, and his father took the right approach, which was, hey, if Baal is so strong, let Baal go get Gideon. You know, let the gods fight their own war, and everybody else just calm down. So he risked his family honor to obey God. Now, what he won out of that, I mean, the army, through God's power, defeated the Midianites and restored a sense of security and peace for a while. But there was a risk of the family honor, of not pouring into the system that his dad would have probably said, hey, son, you really need to pour into this system because this is our family system here. We have Ruth. This is in the book of Ruth. Her husband died, and she's now stateless, if you will. She doesn't have a family. She doesn't have an identity. And this is a huge problem for her. And the mother-in-law says, hey, you're young enough, just go back to your family, kind of reintegrate into your system. And she says, no, your God will be my God. Where you go, I will go. Your people will be my people. And she left. Read to the end of the book of Ruth. Ruth is in the line of David, the line of Christ. And so through her children and through that whole story, we see the line of Christ continue on. Samuel's mother prays for a number of years. She has an antagonist who essentially makes fun of her for being barren. And God gives her a son, and she says, okay, when he's old enough, when he's weaned, I will take him to the temple, and the ESV says, I will loan him to the Lord. And so Samuel became a high priest. He was the one who handled the transition into a monarchy, which wasn't God's decision for them, but it got to the line of David. It got to King David, and again, we know that Christ comes through the line of King David. And so Samuel is right there with it. But had she held back, had she had the heart of Babel, this would not have happened. We have Zebedee and his sons. This is Matthew chapter 4. Jesus is walking by the water, and he sees these guys out there fishing. Most of these kinds of businesses are family businesses, kind of like farming here in the States was before farming equipment became a thing. Farmers have big families because he needs lots of boys to go out there and work the field. And so Zebedee has got some sons, and Jesus basically says, hey, you guys, come on. This is James and John. And it says they're standing there in the boat with him. They leave their nets, and they leave their father. I mean, I don't know if you've ever hauled in fishing nets. It's a lot of work. And I imagine if it was a 4-man job, and now it's a 2-man job, it's difficult. But James, who's he? He becomes the pastor of the church in Jerusalem. He's the elder there. John, we get several books of the Bible from John. Both of these are people who walked with Christ and led the early apostolic movement there. One of the most obvious examples of children leaving and parents sending is Jesus. I mean, there is no greater chasm through which to send a child than God sending his son, John 3:16, to earth. But the salvation of the world is at stake. I mean, he didn't just send his son on a happy vacation. He didn't just send his son on a weekend trip, on a long-term mission. I mean, he knew he was sending his son to his death. I mean, his son was sent with the purpose of dying, with the purpose of there being this substitutionary transaction happen on our behalf. This is why Jesus was sent. And so, kind of the prime example would be Christ and God sending him on our behalf. Matthew 19, Jesus is answering some objections that people have about leaving family, and Jesus said to them, "Truly I say to you, in the new world, when the Son of Man will sit on his glorious throne, you who have followed me will also sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. And everyone who has left houses or brothers or sister or father or mother or children or lands for my name's sake will receive 100-fold and will inherit eternal life. But many who are first will be last, and the last first." That first last and last first is an easy way to understand what is the mindset of someone who is leaving everything they have. It's a backwards way of thinking. Thinking, instead of focusing on college and education and success and career, I'm going to go hat in hand and ask churches and ask Christians to give me money so that I can go live over here in this place so that I can follow God. This is a backwards way of thinking. This is putting yourself last. And so Jesus is not just randomly throwing this verse in there that we can pull out of context and put on a pillow. This is tied to this idea of giving up family and houses and wealth and identity and all of those things that these things bring. We're giving up to follow Christ. So I want to compare for a minute the Babel complex and the Nomad complex. In the Babel complex, we have making a name for ourselves, right? That's the main focus. How do I do things in my life that will benefit me and my family and our family name, honor, wealth, status, etc.? In the Nomad complex, it's make God's name great. Abraham is the first one to go out there. Paul later calls this the gospel in advance that was given to Abraham. And so Abraham is going out there to make God's name great, and he does it again and again. He doesn't want the local tribes to bless him. He says, look, I'm not going to take your money, lest you say, you have made me great. I want you to know that God did this. Number two, Babel complex, they remain where they are. The Nomad complex is fill the earth to the ends of the earth. This is the Nomad complex. We remain where we are. We reject God's plan to fill the earth. Nomad complex walks in God's promise. We see Abraham not just hear these things from God, but he has to step out. And this isn't the last time God asked him to step out. We've been listening to the Bible during dinner to do our reading plan, and we had a somber conversation about Abraham and sacrificing his son. Such a radical thing that God called him to do. God continued to test him, to continue to say, I will make this promise to you, but I'm asking you to do this. What will you do? And Scripture says Abraham was justified by faith. So we see that they walk in God's promise rather than rejecting God's plan. I know part of the history of our church is that when this neighborhood went from being a predominantly white suburb to being very diverse, that many churches and many people left. They left for better places. And this is a problem. When people are leaving and fleeing and only looking for the nice things in life, this is a Babel mindset of how do I protect and keep what is mine? Number four, Babel complex, they work with those who are just like us. Everyone had the same language, and this was the point of unity. The moment the language changed, their ability to work together evaporated, and it says they spread out. Right? So God punished them, and then they spread out, but them spreading out was always part of the plan. I was for a brief period, I was a pastor, interim pastor at a church that was in an area somewhat like Aleph, maybe not quite as diverse, but had gone through the same kind of shift that this community had gone through. There were other churches in that area that had kind of moved further out into the suburbs, and my kind of stern word back to the church, which was, I was encouraging them to stay put. And the reason was, I said, look at who's around you. There's a mosque that moved in, a mile from here. And there's all of these nations around. And it seems that, this is coming from Acts 17, it seems that God is sending these people from around the world to these Christian countries, and they're living right next to a lot of Christians and right next to churches in order for us to reach them. And I think that if we just move to Sealy's not going to be far enough. And then we're going to move to Columbus, and Columbus is not going to be far enough. And then we're going to move to, just keep going out there. There's a tiny little town in North Texas called Amarillo, super diverse. Tons of Somalis, Ethiopians, Arabs, people from Muslim background, Hindu background. Tons and tons and tons of internationals out there. You can't flee to a cow town in Texas now without being surrounded by the nations. And so instead of thinking, how do I run and find a place that's comfortable and protected and safe for me and people just like me who think like me, God's just going to keep sending them. That seems to be what's happening in the world right now. And so maybe drop the Babel complex and pick up the Nomad complex. So instead of working with those just like us, the Nomad complexes live as a scattered minority. You see, being a part of a walled city at this time, man, huge advantage. You can't come fight me with your bow and arrow. I'm in a city. To leave and to go live in tents, you're exposed. You're really exposed. They come charging through with a bunch of camels. I don't know if you've ever been next to a camel. I mean, they can step on a grown man. They can run over some tents. They can mess some stuff up. Camels are strong enough, if they grab you by the shoulder, they can pick you up and fling you. And they're surprisingly fast. You always see them as these slow, lumbering, kind of, moose-like animals. But when they get up and go, they can move. And so living as a scattered minority, wandering from place to place, hoping that the people who are already there, who've already kind of cut their slice out of the middle and already probably have walls up and defenses, hoping that they don't decide, hey, let's go kill the outsiders. But that's what God called Abraham to. Number 5, they build for permanence. There's brick and mortar. The temple there at Ur is not the Tower of Babel, but it's from a very close time period. It's still standing. You go to this part of the world, there's so many old things. I used to ride with my friends as we drive through the city, and I'm a naturally curious person. And one of my friends, Mohammed, says, Brian, he was sick of the questions. He goes, Brian, we have many old things here. Right? This was his explanation for the next, what he viewed to be the next 50 questions about, what is this? What is that? What's this from? Right? I'm doing that thing. This stuff is just everywhere over there. And so they're building for permanence, but now their permanence is just a monument to their own ego. Instead, number 5, on the Nomad side, they live with flexibility. A tent, man, the grass dries up here, the water dries up here, pick up the tent pegs, load it on the camel, move on over there. They can follow and they can wander wherever the resources are. Number 6, Babel complex seeks protection. It wants the walled cities. There is faith in these walls are going to keep us safe. I think this past year, people who have trusted in financial security and in modern Western medicine and the scientific worldview that we all live by here, we've seen these are really shoddy defenses. Once something gets out of control, these are not great defenses. We see this happen again and again and again through the Bible, right? You've got Pharaoh's army, biggest army in that region at the time, wiped out in a single battle as they go through the Red Sea, and God closes it in on them. We see Joshua and Caleb and the other people at that time going in, and we see the walls of Jericho falling down. You see God calling down hornets. Try fighting a hornet army. God sends hornets to fight, and he sends boulders to fight. There's no wall, there's no chariot, there's no shield that stands up against this. Which is why David says, some trust in horses and chariots, but we will trust in the name of the Lord. So when you're living in a tent, when you're on the move, when you are unprotected, when you don't have walls around, you have to trust in God's protection. We were in Egypt during the Arab Spring, and obviously there was a lot of crazy things happening there. About 1,000 people died in our city. They were mostly people who were fighting down with the police, and if you weren't fighting with the police, you were typically safe. But a lot was, there's a lot of spillover all around, and every day we're just reminded we have to trust in God's protection. We can't trust in our blue passport. It's pretty worthless in a mob environment and can actually make things worse. We can't trust that the embassy is going to come get us. We can't trust in our organization. There's not much that we can trust in. We could just have to trust in God. Number 7, work and success are life's ultimate goals. We're going to build this monument. We're going to build this city, this tower. This is going to be our name. It's going to make our name great. People are going to see it, and they're going to know who we are. This is a boasting in their own ability. Number 7 on the Nomad complex, God's presence and promise are life's ultimate goals. Abraham has nothing else. He doesn't even have his family. He's wandered out into the desert to follow God that he doesn't quite know yet, and that's all he can hope for. What if God's presence left him in the desert? He'd be done. He has to live by God's presence. And so in closing, I have a couple of questions to ask you. The first is, are you willing to follow God at all cost? We saw in these stories where both Evelyn and the other young lady were dealing with even Christians who had the opinion of, you're doing this for your own ego. You're doing this for prestige. You're doing this because you don't like your family. You're doing this to be an American. You're doing this because you're trying to be individualistic. And are you willing to follow God at all costs? And some of those costs are things like loss of family name, loss of honor, loss of security. There's a number of missionaries throughout missionary history who, when they became a missionary, their parents disowned them. There are a number of people when they became Christian in Hindu, Muslim, and Buddhist context, their family disowned them. And again, we think, oh, well, just go over here and get a job. No, they're going to ask, who's your family? Oh, well, just use that money you've got in the bank account. No, you had a family bank account, and they cut you off from that. Will we follow God, even if it means giving up all of our resources, all of our identity, all of our honor, all of our security? And there's kind of a hard stop on this one. If we're not willing to, Luke 14 says we're not able to be his disciple. If we're not able to renounce all that we have, we're not able to be his disciple. Number 2, are you willing to let your family members go and serve God? This is maybe for the person who has someone in their life who says, you know what, God is calling me to do this. Do you have the heart of Hannah, of Zebedee, and ultimately of God, of sending someone? Are you willing to let them give up prestigious careers and education in order to go follow God? We've got our kid cutouts here, and in the past year we've been doing global kids with a lot of emphasis on mission, and I can see in your kids. I can see kids that, would rather be somewhere else and are being polite, but, it's not super interesting to them. But then I see other kids that every time a different speaker stands up and shares about a missionary story or a missionary text from the Bible, or we pray for a people group, they're the ones whose eyes are twice the size of everybody else's. This is coming. This is coming. But are you willing to let your children do this? For the girl who was from East Asia, when I heard, she had initially come to the church to present about some organization she was working with in Houston. And then I was talking about, well, what would this look like in the future? And she goes, actually, I'm going to go be a missionary. And I had just heard her story of my family left Vietnam, and she talked about how hard their time was in coming here, and an amazing story, a very tragic story as well. And the moment she said this, the very next question was, what does your family think about this? And she looked at me, she goes, nobody's ever asked me that before. And it's because I've been around enough people where their family has some claim to them. This is not just an international problem. I don't want to make it sound like all of these challenges are not for white people. We had people when we went with IMB that their families were actually seeking legal means to have the children removed from their kids because they were so angry that they were going to go be a missionary anywhere else. And so they had contacted CPS, they had gone to judges and courts. Ultimately, there was nothing they could do. But that's really hard when it's your mother and your father saying, we're going to seek out a legal venue to take your children because we're so angry at you for going to being a missionary. Finally, are you willing to live sent? See, Abraham was given this commission by God with nowhere to fulfill it. There was no obvious next step. Everyone always, they go, man, God's calling me to be a missionary. What are my next steps? And, for me as a mobilizer, I want to break it down and make it easy. All right, step 1, step 2, step 3. But God calls Abraham, and other than just go, there's no next step that he gives him. There's no career path. There's no, well, you're in phase 1 of sending, and then you'll hit these markers, and then you'll move to phase 2, and then you'll exit, and, there's nothing like that. And so I talk about many of these Bible characters that I brought up as examples, like Joseph. Joseph was called to be a certain kind of person, and he was this kind of person wherever God put him. He was that kind of person in his father's house. He was that kind of person in Potiphar's house. He was this kind of person in prison. And then finally, after many, many years of a downwardly mobile trajectory, God made him number 2 in Egypt because he was the same kind of person there as well. And so God used that talent, and then he just moved him around. And so if we can figure out what is that thing that God has called us to do, wherever we are, right here, in my neighborhood, in my home, in my office, if we can do that, if we can live as though we are sent right now, we can start fulfilling this nomadic mentality that God gave to Abraham. J.D. Greer says, we seek to live multicultural lives, not just host multicultural events. I love this. I'm going to change it a little bit. Let's say we seek to live missional lives, not just host missional events. I love programs. Programs are how we get a lot of things done as church, as a denomination, as organizations. But it's easy then to substitute the program that we've developed and love with the call that God has given. And this thing is supporting the other thing, but at times it's easy for it to supplant. And so, not that we should not do programs, not that we should not have events, but we have to focus on everywhere that God has us. How can we live as though we are sent? Rather than thinking, well, one day I'm going to have my life together. One day I'll have my funds raised. One day all of my obligations here will be concluded. One day I'll move to that other people group that God has called me to. And one day I'll have a bunch of friends in that community. And then one day I'll learn how to share my faith with them. And then it's a one-day missionary. That's no missionary at all. Nothing magical happens once you get all of those things. It's sort of like people with wealth here, right? How much wealth is enough? A little bit more, right? We just think, well, if I get to the next pay status, then I'll have enough. If I get that next thing, then I'll be No, we're not. It's not going to happen. And so how do we do this right here, right now? Say, you know what? God is putting in me the heart to go overseas. I talk with so many of you that have a very missional heart, but you're in a visa situation where you can't go anywhere. That's okay. God can use that. I know some people who are on the brink perpetually of being sent away and think, well, I want to be part of this thing in Houston, but I might be back in the many other places in a month, or I might not. I don't know. Well, if you live sent here for that month, that's not a loss. And if God sends you back home and you learned how to live sent while you were here, not a loss. So we're able to follow God. Are you willing to follow God at all costs? Are you willing to let your family members serve God? And are you willing to live sent? Let's pray. God, I pray that you would take those Babel-like qualities that we center our lives around. I read the story of Babel, and I can't help but see American culture. I can't help but see elements even in my own life where I want to hang on to the things that I have, the prestige that I have, the security that I have, instead of following you and being willing to just go. To just go and step by step seek your presence, seek your face. So God, I pray that as we come to this time of invitation, I pray that you will be doing something in our hearts where you will expose what are those Babel attitudes that we have and how do we get to that nomadic attitude that Abraham had. Lord, we ask this in your name.